Firstly, I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me to give this talk, and particularly to give me the chance to have Mr. John Howard as a member of my audience. John Howard took until his fourth term to define and to actualise his approach to Indigenous affairs. As he says in Lazarus Rising, "Our last year in government finally saw a paradigm change. It was as if the dam had finally burst, and much of the approach which had held sway for a generation or more was swept away." Actually, I might need a glass of water, Tom. Thank you. Mr. Howard is referring to the Commonwealth taking over Indigenous affairs in the Northern Territory, known as the Northern Territory Intervention. In my presentation today, I will not revisit the debate about the intervention. Rather, I will contextualise it as prime ministerial theatre, and I will point to 5 legacies. In 1996, Mr. Howard found himself up against a policy orthodoxy that he describes in Lazarus Rising as, quote, "separate development with a heavy overlay of guilt and shame." This orthodoxy was supported by the old guard of the Aboriginal leadership, the ALP, and much of the press, he says. What does separate development mean? The term is open to being understood as including public policies supported by the Howard government. In his first 3 terms, Mr. Howard did much to perpetuate policy initiatives by Labor that could be called separate development. I'll mention 4. ATSIC, which he did not abolish until 2004, near the end of his third term, and only after the ALP announced that it would abolish ATSIC. The Native Title Act, which Mr. Howard did not repeal, but amended in a strenuous struggle with the Senate in 1998. The Howard contribution to the history of conservative public policy in Indigenous affairs was to recast native title so that Conservatives could reconcile themselves to a Commonwealth statute that they had refused to engage with only 5 years before under Dr. Hewson. Another continuity between Keating and Howard policies was the Indigenous Land Fund, as a Keating initiative complementary to the Native Title Act, into which every Howard budget poured increasing amounts of money. In his 3rd and 4th terms, Mr. Howard legislated the Corporations Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Act, which renewed the distinct regulatory regime that applies to Indigenous Australians organisations. So Conservatives in Australia may well rail against separate development for Indigenous Australians, but they find it impossible in practice to avoid making territorial, legal and institutional distinctions between Indigenous and other Australians. This raises the question of whether there is a distinct conservative approach to Indigenous affairs, and I look forward to discussion of that. If there is, then being against separate development does not name it. Dealing with Indigenous Australians' demands for social justice has been a challenge for every Australian Prime Minister since William McMahon. To form a public relationship with a demanding Indigenous constituency is one of the inescapable tasks that defines every Prime Minister. Mr. Howard was aware that Paul Keating had won widespread, if not universal, admiration for legislating the Native Title Act in 1993. Keating's strategy had included publicly endorsing the critical history of British colonisation. In his reformulation of Australians' destiny, the repair of a damaged relationship between Indigenous and other Australians became a central task for the nation. In 1992-93, the Conservatives, under John Hewson, had opposed the Commonwealth's legislative recognition of native title. In the years leading up to Howard's victory in 1996, Keating's approach to native title had won for the Labor Party the status of Indigenous champion. In a 1998 speech, Mr. Howard recalled Keating, quote, talking about how the Native Title Bill was going to nourish the Labor Party for 2 generations, end of quote. In Lazarus Rising, Mr. Howard is viscerally offended by the evident ideological bond, as he saw it, between the press, the Aboriginal leadership and the Keating cabinet in the period 1992-96. Mr. Howard deeply disliked the ALP's assumption that Labor policies defined social justice for Indigenous Australians. In 1998, he scorned what he called Labor's phony claims of racism. In Lazarus Rising, he refers to the, quote, McCarthyist smear tactics of the Keating government. He was offended by the vitriol of an age cartoon depicting him and Peter Reith mounted on horses and shooting Aboriginal people. He recalls Robert Tickner as epitomising the politically correct left of the Labor Party. As far back as 1989, Mr Howard had characterised the ALP as guilt-ridden. In 1995, he vowed, "I am not going to be a party to the guilt industry." This climate encouraged in Labor MPs a belief that they, quote, hold some kind of political monopoly of concern about the Aboriginal people of Australia, end of quote. In Lazarus Rising, he refers to the, quote, abjectly apologetic language so often used by the Labor Party and others. It troubled Mr Howard that Aboriginal leaders seemed to expect a similar abjection from him and his government. His refusal to apologise to the stolen generations signalled his distaste for the abject position. But for that, he was punished by the open disdain of Aboriginal leaders and many in the press. Televised images of Mr Howard's May 1997 confrontation with a largely Indigenous audience, quote, played strongly to the view that I was at permanent loggerheads with Indigenous Australians, end of quote. Patrick Dodson's refusal of reappointment to the chair of the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation was a public rebuff. In October 1997, Noel Pearson called Liberals racist scum. The problem for a Prime Minister seeking to position himself as a champion of Indigenous Australia was that to reconcile Conservatives to the Native Title Act, Mr Howard had to diminish Indigenous rights conferred by that Act, and he had to be seen to be doing so. On the 30th anniversary of the 1967 referendum, Mr Howard conceded that his proposed amendments to the Native Title Act were intended to reduce the rights of native title holders whose ancestral country was under pastoral lease. He defended this reduction of rights as a restoration of equality under the rule of law because, quote, the pendulum had swung too far towards Indigenous rights. When presenting himself as rightly reversing Indigenous Australians' recent gains, Mr Howard had to distance himself from One Nation, whose appeal to Conservative voters included the theme of Aboriginal privilege. In Lazarus Rising, Mr Howard recalls this difficulty. He writes that while in attacking multiculturalism, ATSIC and separatist policies for black and white Australians, he and Hanson were in tune with community sentiment, they differed on whether Indigenous Australians were the most disadvantaged group in our midst. Mr Howard persistently presented Aboriginal people as the deserving disadvantaged. For example, he declared his compassion for Indigenous Australians in a 1995 speech. In 1996, he said that Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders were, quote, the most profoundly disadvantaged in our midst. In May 1997, he pledged to, quote, address the profound economic and social disadvantage continuing to be suffered by Indigenous Australians. The widely accepted idea that Indigenous Australians were disadvantaged gave Mr Howard a way to shape the meaning of reconciliation. In 1991, the Conservative parties had voted for the bill that established the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation. In government, Mr Howard sought to control the meaning of that much contested word. Mr Howard once described reconciliation as, quote, an unstoppable force. In May 1997, Mr Howard aligned his approach to reconciliation with what he called the spirit of the 1967 referendum. If the 1967 referendum, he said, spoke of anything, it spoke of a need to remedy in a practical way the disadvantage of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I have counted 16 uses of the word practical in 10 parliamentary statements about Indigenous affairs that Mr Howard made from 1996 to 1999. In Mr Howard's view, there was debate on some Indigenous policy issues, but there was widespread agreement that to relieve disadvantage, reconciliation must include policies that were practical. This consensus meant that, quote, nobody has any kind of moral monopoly of concern about Indigenous people. For Mr Howard to make credible his concern for Indigenous Australians, he needed to form public bonds with Indigenous leaders. He had made it difficult for Indigenous leaders to bond publicly with him in the period 1996 to 98, when he was cutting the budgets of Aboriginal programs, diminishing the property rights of native title holders, and refusing to apologise to the stolen generations. However, it eventually became possible for Mr Howard to name Indigenous people of like mind. On June the 3rd, 1999, Mr Howard noted in Parliament that the critique of welfare dependency being articulated by Noel Pearson, quote, "a person who has not always been complimentary about the policies of the government I lead," end of quote. On the 26th of August 1999, moving a motion of support for reconciliation, Mr Howard thanked Senator Aidan Ridgway, mentioning him warmly 4 times in his speech. He saw Ridgway's cooperation as symptomatic of Indigenous leaders starting to meet him halfway. In the context of such a conciliatory moment, we can understand the Howard government amending the ATSIC Act to give it more autonomy. From 1999, the chair of ATSIC was no longer appointed by the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, but elected by the ATSIC commissioners. ATSIC's commissioners elected Jeff Clark as their chair. Clark's insistence on distinct Indigenous political rights, codified in a treaty, could have been a potent counter to Mr Howard's theme that reconciliation must remain practical. However, Clark's personal integrity was soon widely questioned, and in 2001 to 2002, Indigenous leaders such as Lowitja O'Donoghue, Patrick Dodson and Aidan Ridgway publicly distanced themselves from him and from ATSIC. As Senator Bob McMullen conceded in 2004, quote, "many Indigenous people feel let down by the leadership of ATSIC and particularly by the currently suspended ATSIC chair." The Labor opposition, closely followed by the closely in time, followed by the Howard government, announced in March and April of 2004 that they would abolish ATSIC. Labor said it would replace it with an elected Aboriginal body. A June 2004 Assembly of Aboriginal leaders in Adelaide called for a nationally representative body. In November 2004, the Howard government replaced ATSIC with a hand-picked National Indigenous Council, chaired by Magistrate Sue Gordon. The willingness of outstanding Indigenous persons to be so selected as advisors was a political breakthrough, as auspicious for Mr Howard as the coalition's at last getting a majority in the Senate. The disgrace of Jeff Clark in the period 1999 to 2003 highlighted a problem in Indigenous Australia that Indigenous Australians were increasingly open in discussing: the insecurity of Indigenous women and children in some communities. The generalised notion of disadvantaged Indigenous Australians, for whom a Prime Minister could have credible concern, was acquiring a more particular face: the battered woman, the abused child. In 2007, this object of government compassion was on display in a report to the Northern Territory Government, "Little Children Are Sacred." The Howard government seized on this expose of Indigenous vulnerability and announced the Northern Territory Emergency Response. This package included such controversial measures as imposed changes in Aboriginal land tenure and restrictions on how recipients of welfare could spend money. Sue Gordon agreed to head a task force to oversee the National Emergency Response, thus securing some Aboriginal leaders' endorsement of the intervention. In Lazarus Rising, Mr Howard claims that the Northern Territory intervention marked a paradigm change. Let me conclude by pointing to 5 legacies of the Howard government's approach to Indigenous affairs. First, these years revealed separate development to be a stubborn reality, not something any government can realistically be against. Much of the Howard government's practice conceded that Indigenous Australians are a distinct people with distinct rights and distinct modes of collective action. Second, the Conservative acknowledgement of Indigenous difference placed emphasis on their socio-economic deficits. at the expense of their distinct rights and capacities as peoples. To say that Indigenous Australians were distinct not in their rights but in their needs politicises the concept of disadvantage. This has provoked questioning of what critics called deficit discourse, that is, the tendency to represent Indigenous Australians in terms of what they lack. The third legacy of the Howard years is that we now have a more diverse and contentious Indigenous public sphere. You cannot throw a single ideological blanket over those who speak up for Indigenous Australia. Fourth, the abolition of ATSIC, a joint effort by Labor and the Conservatives, and the unnegotiated amendments of the Northern Territory Land Rights Act in 2007 have taught Indigenous Australians that legislated recognition of their rights is weak. Constitutional recognition of Indigenous rights is what Indigenous Australians will continue to insist on. And fifth and finally, the intervention put welfare recipients on notice that they can expect to have their lives more closely administered than ever before. The intrusive invigilation of the poor has become largely bipartisan.
Tim, thank you. Can I ask if what you've described for us are three phases in the Howard government's approach to Indigenous affairs? The first perhaps starts with Hindmarsh Island or something like that, runs through then into 1996, the difficulties you explained up until about 1998. There seems then to be something of a hiatus or a relationship rebuilding, and then in 2004-05 there are practical steps and the Howard government may have found its way. Is that the kind of broad picture that you're painting for us?
Yes, I think that would be a fair enough way of periodising it, and perhaps that second period can be further fleshed out by mentioning that it's in those years that you had the climax of the reconciliation decade and the celebration of Australia's federation, which were two, if you like, nation buildings or nation defining moments where it was important for both sides to find some way of talking about the nation that was acceptable to their constituency.
And in terms of the Prime Minister's own view, did I hear you suggest that there's two parts to this? If politically he was criticised, he could accept that as part of the remit of being in politics. But it was the commandeering of morality or care that, seen from what you have presented to us, was the thing that produced the strongest reaction. Would that be, again, a fair way of characterising things?
Yes, and I mean, I think my reading of that relevant chapter in Lazarus Rising is that it's there is a sense of real injury in the writing, that how dare people judge me for being less morally committed to the nation than Labor. Yes, I think my understanding is that Mr Howard took this personally. He can confirm or not.
And one of my students, Adrian Davidson, raised the question yesterday more generally, quoted Theodore Roosevelt, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Mm-hmm. If the Howard government sort of seemed to start badly and talking about buckets of relinquishment and phrases like that and appeared to be wanting to right some imbalance, what could it do to show it cared between, say, 98 and other than the more, if you like, practical and substantial measures that it took, say, in 2004-05 and thereafter?
Well, I think that defining caring as addressing the gap became, and calling that practical as opposed to symbolic reconciliation was the discursive strategy adopted from the second of those two periods and into the third of those two periods. I think that became a key concept for Mr Howard to talk about Indigenous policy, the idea of relieving disadvantage.
Because it seems to me that if you look at that image of that reconciliation speech, and if I might kind of seem or give an impression of how it sounded, I kind of whatever, mm-hmm. And we've talked about that particular speech and the difficulty. I know that I wouldn't like it if people turned their backs on me as I was speaking. To come back from that, though, was that not in itself either an achievement on his part or a show of good grace and goodwill from the Aboriginal community?
Well, I think you could give credit to both sides I think it required fortitude, personal fortitude for Mr. Howard to come back from a public rebuff like that, and he did. Yeah.
Thank you. Your questions, comments, please. And Scott Prasser to start off. Thank you.
Where do you place the motion of regret passed by Parliament? Didn't everyone agree?
Yes. It seems to me regret became a term that was satisfactory to all except those who thought it wasn't strong enough and it needed to be an apology. To me, the difference between regretting something and saying you apologise for it came to be defined as the degree to which contemporary Australians should take responsibility for past actions. Of course, in the dictionary definitions of regret and apology, there might not be such a difference, that difference between them. But that difference was made to be very important. So, one thing I should say is that there's never been any doubt in my mind that Mr. Howard has committed himself to the fundamental theme of what he's also denounced as the black armband view of history. That is, the theme being that the British occupation of Australia was a violent act of dispossession in which many people were harmed. I don't think Mr. Howard has ever resiled from that well-established finding of historical scholarship.
But are you suggesting that all those who maybe saw the apology as a defining issue didn't also want to exploit it as a wedge?
I think that...
they sincerely believed over here that there should be an apology.
Yes.
But it was hard then to work out whether that sincerity was sincere when it looked like it was a wedge.
It became politicised, and so, of course, its meaning changed. It became whatever Mr. Howard did was then a move within the party debate and a polarised cultural politics. So the chance to give an apology, I think, was very brief. It was taken by the state and territory parliaments in the winter of 1998, without fuss. In fact, most people don't remember that every legislature in Australia apologised to the stolen generations in the winter of 1998. Or is it 96? No, it was 98, yes. Yeah.
Other questions, please?
Can I make a comment? Just in the interest of Canberra, can I say...
Just the microphone will come, Mr. Howard. Just a microphone.
I have virtually no quarrel with your analysis in your scripted speech. I think you got the three phases correctly. I think the Port Douglas gathering after the 2004 election, which brought together what you might call the Noel Pearson group of Aboriginal leaders and the Dodson group, which in effect Pearson said, well, whether you like it or not, you've all got to cooperate. Yeah. I mean, I might make the observation that it had taken 4 elections for the government to win that acceptance, but you remember we had the walk by Michael Long, the Essendon footballer, and there was a general atmosphere of sort of we'd finally arrived at some kind of understanding. Just on the question of the history of British settlement, I adhere to the definition of the British arrival as being one of settlement. I don't recall ever having endorsed the view that it was an invasion. I happen to believe that the best alternative happened for Australia because of the options available at that time. Being colonised or settled by the British was far and away the best. As to the question of the amount of violence and the motivations involved in the British occupation, well, there's endless debate about that, in which arguments, as you know, there's reference made to the instructions given by the Colonial Office to Phillip and so forth, which speak rather more benignly of the British intentions than some of the critics subsequently have. The only other thing I would say about the question of the apology is that I was sceptical about the bringing them home investigation from the beginning. I remember having a meeting with Ronald Wilson and Mick Dodson in my office, in which I said we were not going to provide additional funds, that I questioned the credibility of the proposition that one generation could apologise for the mistakes and so forth of earlier generations. And you will, of course, agree that subsequent to the defeat of my government and the apology given by Kevin Rudd, I declined as a matter of consistency to be involved in that day because I'd taken a position. But it having been given, you move on, and it's happened. But I don't, as a matter of candour to you and to the audience, I don't resile from the position I took for the reasons that I explained perhaps inadequately. And I think it's fair to say that my loss of control at that particular gathering to which Tom has referred to and which continued sometime to embarrass me is one of those mistakes one makes in politics. But as I say, I thought your scripted analysis was forensic, and I have no essential quarrel with it.
Thank you.
Well, given a Minister for Indigenous Affairs is here with us, can you say something about the ministerial arrangements the Howard government had for Aboriginal affairs across the 11 years, 8 months and 23 days of the Howard government? Were they well suited to the need? Were they fit for purpose? Or did the Howard government never quite work out where to place and how to deal with Indigenous affairs in the portfolio system?
I'd like to address that by thinking about where ATSIC stands. I mean, the main, if you like, body over which a Minister for Aboriginal Affairs could have any influence was ATSIC, which spent about half the Commonwealth budget. I think one of the problems, the potential future of ATSIC, which was never pursued after 2004, was that ATSIC could have been slowly grown to be given more and more functions, and also that it could have been given a place in the key intergovernmental forums such as COAG, and also at the state level, where, I mean, so many of the services that Aboriginal communities rely on are delivered by the state governments. The idea that you can get a lot of leverage from a Commonwealth statutory body such as ATSIC is a problem to me. You need to find ways for ATSIC to have to be effective at the level of making concrete decisions about program allocations at the state level as well. So I think that there wasn't enough creative thinking done by anyone about, or at least on the government side, though I'd be very interested to talk to Mr Ruddock about this. My impression from reading the press in 2003, 2004 is that Mr Ruddock was trying to save ATSIC from itself. And I'd be interested to get your comments on that later, sir. And that it's always interested me that the decision by the Howard government to abolish ATSIC didn't come until Mr Latham had, as it were, given permission to the Conservatives to take such a step.
And your reading of that decision, was it that it was Jeff Clark, it was the hole into which ATSIC had dug itself in fighting? Was the model sound, but the people not best placed to exploit the potential that ATSIC had?
I think that the problems are actually, they need to be explained to some extent biographically. That is, I think that it's easy to imagine there being much better leaders for ATSIC in the early 2000s than those they chose. There are some outstanding Indigenous leaders who would have done a better job than Jeff Clark, and who wouldn't have brought the baggage of his past with them. It was a really unfortunate choice, and I think unfortunate that Mr Clark didn't distinguish his own interest from that of his organisation.
But does that mandate its abolition?
definitely not. I think that there was a program. I think there needs to be national Indigenous political representation of some kind. We can argue about whether it also has program responsibilities or whether it's just representative. But, you know, it was, I think, an act of vandalism, to tell you the truth, that's my opinion, to just get rid of ATSIC. And there was no substitute for just appointing a group of Aboriginal people to be the spokespeople for Indigenous Australia, however worthy as individuals those hand-picked people were.
But how then was the government going to retain it when Labor said it would get rid of it? So in other words, I can't believe Mark Latham was going to try and wedge John Howard on Aboriginal affairs, but it's not that, is it? It's something else.
Well, Latham's position was that they would replace it with another elected body. Of course, Labor in government never did that. So, I mean, I'm not here to defend Mark Latham. I don't think anybody in this room is here to defend Mark Latham.
I think that's been our experience the last 24 hours. It just seems as though you say, oh, Latham said we're going to get rid of ATSIC. It then gave permission to the government to do so, whereas you could argue what would happen if they had decided not to do that. How would the Howard government have looked strangely when here's Latham and Labor saying it's going and the government's going to keep it? It's an odd political set of alignments.
If you think of the trajectory of my narrative, it would have been a golden opportunity for the Conservatives to say we are going to, flawed as this institution is, we are going to defend it from the wreckers on the other side of the house. And they would have, it would have been quite possible to say that in a way, I think, that won back the Indigenous critics of ATSIC. And the Howard government had before it a report co-authored by Jackie Huggins, which put forward proposals for the reconstruction of ATSIC. They'd put a lot of thought into this and done a lot of consultation. And to just sweep all that political creativity aside is, it's a precedent to what we saw the Turnbull government do, which is just to sweep aside in a matter of days all the thinking that had gone into the Uluru Statement. I don't think you can treat Indigenous political creativity so cheaply. You need to engage with it.
Any final comments or questions before we conclude? Tim, well, we've been treated this morning to a very quick but a detailed and evocative presentation of the Howard government and Indigenous affairs. Would everyone please join with me in showing our gratitude? Thank you.